Hi, I'm Wayne Cook, a Senior Technical Instructor at MuleSoft, and also a friend of Max. In today's mini course, we'll be looking at how to create an API spec in RAML. But before we look at the how, let's ask ourselves why. An API spec is essentially an interface definition, which defines how you would interact with a piece of functionality such as a service. It also provides the basis of creating a new application where we can use this like a contract or a template that says this application will provide the functionality defined in the API spec or interface. The API spec is also used in many areas of the API lifecycle, which we'll learn about in the journey. So let's get into it and have a look. Okay, let's create an API spec. Firstly, we'll need to log on to the Anypoint platform website. Here's one I did earlier. And then we can open up Design Center. There's a link on the front page. There's also a link in the menu. So you can have your illusion of choice and pick whichever way you want to open that. And this is Design Center. Now, on the right-hand side here, you can see there's a Create New button. If I click on that, gives me some choices. The first choice is new API spec, which is why we're here. There's also a choice for new API spec fragment, which we'll talk more about later. And not relevant to us, there's new Mule app, which allows you to create basic integration flows in a web interface. And the option below that is import all these things that you've done previously and export it. So we'll go into new API spec. And I'm going to give our API spec a name. That's going to be accounts API, and we're good to go with that. But I'm just going to pause and have a look at this screen for a minute. So we have two options. I'm comfortable designing it on my own, which is what we're using. That's a code editor. And there's also Guide Me Through It, which is a visual interface wizard-based approach. We've also got two modeling languages supported in API Designer. There's RAML, which is what we're using, which is RAML 1.0, the latest version. There's also RAML 0.8 in there, an earlier version, and we have Open API Spec, or what used to be known as Swagger, supported as well. There's two different versions, version 2 and version 3, and they both come in two different flavors, JSON or YAML. But like I said, we're going with RAML 1.0, so I'll select that and then click on the Create API Spec button. So let's have a quick look at the API Designer interface before we jump into developing. On the left-hand side, we have a resource area where you can add files, folders, exchange dependencies, and other things. In the middle, that's the code editor. That's where the magic happens. Just below the code editor is the shelf. This provides code suggestions and auto-completion. On the right-hand side here, we have the API console. The API console provides a human-readable summary of the RAML code that we're going to write. Okay, so before we write some RAML code, I want to create a couple of folders that we'll use later in this mini course. So I'm going to go over to Files. You can see there's a plus button. If I click on the plus button, I want to create a folder. I want a folder for data types. So data -types, and I want another folder for examples, and I'll explain what I'm using these for when we get there, but I'm just setting up the project. So examples, and there we have it, data types and examples. I'll move the cursor to the end of line 2 and I'll create a resource. So I'll hit enter, and to create a resource you go / and then type the name of the resource, and ours is accounts. Then you put a colon at the end and voila, we have a resource. If you have a look in the API console, you can see it says API endpoints and it's put accounts in there. So this is what I meant by the human readable summary. That'll get built more over time. The accounts API endpoint will support both retrieving and creating account information. So with regards to the RAML, if I go to the end of line 4 and then hit enter, it'll take me to line 5 and indent in. If I look in the shelf, what I've got is methods. That's talking about the HTTP methods. Now, you would use get for retrieving and post for creating. So we're going to start by doing our get request functionality. So if I click on the get, it's going to write the code for me and then take me to the next line and indent in. That indent is saying, tell me more about the get. So as per the project requirements, we have the need for defining display names and descriptions for pretty much everything that we do. So here we go. There's our display name and description. That's just a key value pair with defined keys on the left-hand side, and the value is text on the right-hand side. So I'm going to go down to the next line, and the specification also defines that we need some headers or a header. So I'm going to click on headers, and now I'm going to create a header called requester ID. So that's what that's going to look like. We have the name of the header requester ID, and underneath it, metadata. Defined with key value pairs again. We have a display name and a description. We have a type, and the type is the data type for requester ID, which is a string, which is text. If it's required or not, which this is, because it says required is true. And we've also got a default value. The project specification also states that we'll be having some query parameters. So I'm going to move the cursor back so it's horizontally aligned with display name, description, and headers. And I'm going to select query parameters, or indeed type it. Just bear in mind it's got a capital P there. It's in camel case. And I'm going to define my first query parameter, which is type, which will look like that. So we have a query parameter called type. There's a display name, a description, the fact that it's required, the data type. Another thing I'll add is we're going to put in an enumeration, or enum as it's specified here. That's just a list of possible values for type. So if I type enum colon, then I hit enter, you can see it pops me off at the next line, sticks a hyphen and then a space. And I'm going to type the word personal. This is just the type of bank account, a personal account, or hit enter, put a hyphen in, make sure you put a space, and we say business. And there we are. They're the two possible types of bank accounts. So I'm also going to backspace and backspace, so I'm horizontally aligned with type. And I'm going to add two more parameters. One will be name, the other one will be country. And just going to do that, just pasting that in just to avoid typos. So we have name and metadata underneath. So name has display name, description. It's not required. It's a data type string. And we also have country, which has the display name, description. It's not required, and it's a string. Next, we'll define the get response functionality. As part of this, we'll create a accounts data type and some example data to go with it. To define a data type, we'll move the mouse to the folder that we created before called data types. You'll see there's a plus appear. I'm going to click on the plus and select new file. Now, there are different types of API spec fragments that do different things. We want to create a data type, so I'll select that from the drop down and give it a name. It will be account, and then I'll click create or hit enter. And here we are. This is our data type. I'll add a display name and description as per requirements stated before. And then I'm just going to hit enter a couple of times and specify the type. So we go type colon, and what we can see in the shelf is all these different simple data types, and I want an object. So I'll do that. Now, an object consists of properties, and properties are things that describe the object. In this case, it's a bank account, so you'd have the owner of the bank account and the type of bank account and other details. So I'll say properties colon and hit enter. That'll take us to the next line indented in, and I'll go and grab some properties that I created before. So I'll do that. and paste. And what we can see here is a list of properties with the property names and the data types. So we've got things like ID, name details, address details, and other things, and their associated data types there. Some interesting things to point out about this is those question marks. That just means it's an optional property, which will be relevant later on when we do our post request functionality for adding things. So we're following sort of the design pattern that you don't specify a unique identity or a creation date when you're creating a new object, because the backend database or system will do that for us. Okay, now that we have our account data type, let's create some example data for it. Just move our mouse over the examples folder we created earlier, click on the plus again, select new file, and in the drop-down, the second drop-down, we'll change that to be the example. And we'll change the file name to be accounts example.raml, and then click on create. Now, due to the fear of RSI and being efficient, I'm going to paste in some example code here. So what we've got is we have at the top value, saying we're about to provide some example values. And in this example, this has actually got two accounts in it. So I've got a hyphen on the next line, and then I hit enter and indent in. And then we've got key value pairs. These represent all the properties from the data type and example data next to that. So ID all the way down to country, all these values there on the right-hand side of the column are surrounded in double quotes because they're string data or text. Miles doesn't have double quotes around it because that's a numeric value. Creation date doesn't have quotes around it because that's a defined date format, which is, there's details about that in the mini course. And then we have type personal, which is a string again. So that's our first account example. And then I go to the next line, there's another hyphen. This is separating for the next account example. And it's the same thing again, but with different data. So key value pairs, each one of these are the properties defined in the data type. And what's on the right-hand side is our example data. We should also create some example data for use with the post request when we're going to create new accounts. So we can do that pretty quickly by moving the mouse over accounts example.raml. And when the three dots appear, we'll click on that and select duplicate. And I'll call this file accounts example new. And then click on duplicate again. And here we are, copy of the other file. Now I'm just going to take out the ID because this is for a new record. It's not going to use that. And I'll also take out the creation date and the ID and creation date for that second example there. Done. Now that we have our account data type and several examples, let's go and find out where we use this. So we'll open accounts API.raml and we'll go up to the top and add some white space just below the title. And then I can define data types at the top of my file here. So if I use the shelf, you can see types. I click on that, takes me to the next line, and it wants the name of a data type, which we make up on the spot. So I'm going to say account, colon, and from this point I could actually hit enter and create a data type using the same syntax as before, or I could import from a file. So I'm going to say exclamation include, which allows us to import. Then you hit space, and we put in the relative path name to the data type definition. So data types and account RAML. There's our data type account, and we'll use this in our get response. So we'll just scroll down and notice display name, description, headers, query parameters. We'll go to the next line here and we will horizontally align with query parameters. So we can see responses in the shelf here. So if I go to responses, this is where we, define our responses. It takes me to the next line, and then we've got a list of HTTP status codes. We'll define a 200, which is the OK response, as in everything worked okay. This is what you get back. So we'll go 200. And from here, I can define response headers, provide a description, and also define what's in the body. So we'll go body, and then we specify that the data return is in application JSON format. And then the structure of the data will be type, and here's our account data type that we imported before. So I'm going to say what gets returned is data in the structure of account in the format of application JSON. Thing about this though is that's just a single account. We'll be returning multiple accounts. So I'm going to use array syntax, which is open and close square brackets. Now let's go across to the API console, because we haven't explored this much yet. So if I look at accounts and get, I could click on the get, and it takes me to a summary of what a get looks like. If I scroll down, I can see things like, here's the query parameters. We have the account type, the name, the country, the headers. And if I keep scrolling down, we have responses. And you can see a 200 response, and gives you an example of what the response would look like. Now that example is not particularly good in that it just gives you a list of all the properties, and if a property is a string, it just gives you an empty string. If it's a numeric value, it gives you just a 0. That's not very useful for people looking at it. Means it's got limited use, but it's not particularly useful. That's why we create the examples. So if I go to the next line here, back in the code, I'm just going to leave that open at the moment, and then type, or indeed look on the shelf and you can see example. So if I go to example, and using the same syntax as before to import a file, I can go exclamation include space, and we'll go to examples. And what we're after is accounts example.raml, and then select that. And you'll notice it suddenly got a little bit more useful in the example data there. Just have to pull it out a little bit so we can see it, but there's the example of the data that would come back with sensible information in there. That's why we created the example files. And also for other reasons to do with a mocking service, which I'll show you later. And in an almost ironic turn of events, I almost forgot to add a client error. Let me hit enter, and we'll go backspace, 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 and what I want is a 400 status. That's a generic client level error. So go 400, the body will be application JSON, and we'll have an example, and with a message, error retrieving account data. And for the next part, we'll define the post request functionality for when we want to create an account. So I'll hit enter and go all the way back to one indent in, and then I'll select post and add some metadata there. So I've just added a display name and a description, and we also needed the requester ID header as per before. So I'll hit enter, backspace in, one more. Now, with regards to a post request, this is about adding or creating something. So we would define the body and then specify the body will be in application JSON, and we would define the type of data that you would send to the post request, which would be an account object, or in this case, a collection or an array of account objects, because you can create more than one. So we go type and select account, open close square brackets again, and we have an example for this. So we'll select example, space, exclamation include, and we'll put in the example, accounts example new. Fantastic. So focusing on the post response, let me just highlight the code here, and I'm going to paste. The reason I did that was because I forgot to add a description before. Oops. So looking at the responses, same syntax as before. We've got responses followed by the HTTP status code. Now, because we're doing a post, which implies that we're doing a creation, we're using a 201, which is added OK. And then we've got the body in application JSON format. And here's an example that says account created, but not really. We also have the HTTP client error, same as before. Body, application JSON, example, just the message is different. So let's take a moment to pause and reflect and congratulate ourselves for creating an API spec. Good job. Let's have a look around at a couple of things before we publish this. So going back to the API console, you've got this menu in the top left there. If I click on that, it takes us to summary, and I can see accounts has support for get and post. If I go back to that menu, you can also see accounts has support for get and post there. You can expand that out and see the data types as well. So if I was to go to get, like what we saw before, we get a summary of, well, this part is the get request side of things, and we scroll down until we see the responses, and this is our get responses. That's our OK response. This is our client error response. If I go back to the menu in the top left of the API console and go to add account, what I can see is this is the post request side of things. There's our requester ID saying in the request, the body should contain data in this format. Notice the lack of the ID or the creation date. And we scroll down, it's got the metadata about the data types there. We keep scrolling down and we have our post responses, our 201 added OK, and our client response there as well. We'll scroll back up to the top, and let's go back to get for a second. We've got get all accounts. There's an interesting button in right at the top called try it. This is to use a mocking service. This is to simulate using the API. So if I click on try it, what we can see gives us a mocking service URL there, and you've also got all our query parameters. So this is the asterisk there saying that's a required field. So you go personal, and you can put in owner's name and owner's country, Australia. And there we go. And we scroll down, we can see the requester ID, and then you click on send. It simulates making a call. I scroll down, and this is what the data would look like coming back. So that's what the mocking service is doing. That's just using the example data that we defined before. So we can sort of simulate the behavior. Once we're happy with how things are, we can also publish this API spec to Exchange, and that'll create an API portal. So I click on publish and select publish to Exchange. And what we have here is versioning information, asset version, the version of the API specification. And that uses semantic versioning, which is major version, minor version, and patch version. So I'm going to say 1.0.0. And talking about semantic versioning, there's a nice little link there that tells you all about semantic versioning and what denotes a major, minor, and a patch version. If you want to know more, click on that link. And we've also got the API version. I'm going to say this is version 1 to align with my major version there. And then I click on publish to Exchange. So once the publishing is complete, the API spec becomes an API portal, which is targeted at humans reading it. But a lot of the details here are directly copied across. So if you have a look, if I click on summary, that might look a little familiar, right? Accounts has get and post. If I go down to accounts and expand that out, you can see get all accounts and add account. You can also see the data types there. So if I was to click on the get all accounts, this is exactly the same as what we see in the API console and API designer. It's just wider. So if I have a look at it, same details as before. Comes down, we've got our 200 response. We've got our client error response as well. If I scroll back up to the top, on the right-hand side, we have the mocking service to simulate interacting with the API. If I click on home, this is very empty at the moment, but it is a content editor where you can add your own documentation. There's a lot of, the universal symbol of edit nowadays, the pencil. You can click on edit and add your own content. And there's two ways of doing that. You can use a visual editor, and it's much like using any word processor, type in stuff, highlight, click on buttons. Or if you're familiar with Git Markdown format, you can type that in directly. But you have support for, bold, italics, quoted, code blocks, ordered list, unordered list, different size headings, rules, links, images, and even embedded JavaScript. And you can also add other pages with this, add new page, and we'll add terms and conditions. Welcome back. So we did the thing. We created an API spec. We also created multiple API spec fragments, a data type for accounts, and some examples for account data. Now, these API spec fragments are cool in that you can reuse them in other projects. You can also package them up and publish them to Exchange so other team members can use them as well. Some of the key takeaways that we could point out about what we did. The indentation in RAML is very important, and the hierarchy of indentation. So whenever you have something and you indent underneath, it's usually essentially saying, tell me more about the thing that wasn't indented. So, we had account or /accounts : and the get and the post was indented in, saying this get belongs to the resource accounts. And with the get, we also had things like headers and query parameters that were associated with the get. So there was a hierarchy of indents. That's very important. Another thing that's important is remembering we can do modular development, as in create multiple files and then import those files in using the !include. So I hope you enjoyed this, and hope to see you on the next one, where we're going to take this API spec and import that into a new Mule application and implement the functionality for the get and the post. See you there.